Unit number 19, Economy of the Mauryan Empire, a Mauryan period. Objectives. The main aim of this unit is to introduce to you one of the most important aspects of the Mauryan history, namely the organization and changes that took place in the economy of India during this period. Though our focus will be on the Mauryan heartland, the Ganges Valley, we also intend to draw your attention to significant changes that were initiated in this period in other parts of India. After going through this unit, you should be able to understand how different types of resources which are necessary for sustaining an empire were utilized. Understand the main features of agrarian economy, agrarian expansion, and land revenue during this period. Explain how trade was organized and how it expanded, opening up new areas of activity. Understand the nature of urban economy as also how towns and cities grew in this period. Discuss improvements in technology that occurred during this period and analyze how the above developments led to significant socio-economic changes. Introduction. In unit number 18, in this block, in unit number 18, you said about the establishment and expansion of the Mauryan Empire. Here, in this unit, we will familiarize you with the economy of the Mauryan period. In block number 4, you must have read about the nature of the economy in the period before the establishment of Mauryan rule. Here, we will concentrate on the developments which took place during the Mauryan period. We shall start with the general discussion on material and social basis of agricultural and non-agricultural production. Study of agrarian economy is very crucial because the bulk of the population was involved in agriculture. We shall also familiarize you with the organization of land revenue collection. We shall also take into account the impact of agrarian economy and on other spheres of economic activity. This impact was more evident in craft production and commercial activities. Growth in these areas led to improvement in technology, increased circulation of coined money, and growth of urban centers. One more important question which deserves our attention is the role of the state in the overall economic activity. We shall therefore examine to what extent the state intervened in the economy. Did this intervention help the growth of economy or hamper it? Such and related questions would be discussed in the course of this unit. Material and social basis of production. You read in block number 4 about the use of iron technology in agriculture during the second half of the first millennium BC. A substantial surplus of agricultural produce was now created. This surplus not only transformed the material basis of society but also gave rise to new social groups. Many of these new social groups began living in the newly emerging towns. The Greek writer Arrian stated that it was not possible to record with accuracy the number of cities because of their immense numbers. This can be taken to indicate that there may have been an increase in the number of towns in this period. Descriptions by Megasthenes of the well-organized administration of towns indicate large concentration of population in these centers. For living in these towns, regulations were apparently stringent. Excavations have, however, failed to produce any substantial evidence of city planning in this period, and the remains of modern architecture are few. That many of the building structures were made of the burnt bricks can be deduced from the fact that they have been found in large quantities from excavations in sites spread over UP and Bihar. Houses were made also of timber because Megasthenes speak of wooden structures at the modern capital Patliputra. At Kumrahar, modern Patna, excavations also revealed some structures which have been identified as a pillared hall of the modern palace. In terms of structures, one of the most important finds of this period are a large number of ring wells, which were probably used to supply water for domestic purposes. They became widespread in other parts of the country in the subsequent ages. The hallmark of the structural development was thus the extensive use of ring wells and burnt bricks. They imply the easy availability of timber for them to be made. Use of burnt bricks and finds of northern black polished ware shards and other remains help us gauge how widely towns were distributed in several parts of the Mauryan Empire. We shall take up these for discussion later in this unit. In the Ganges Valley, the existence of the towns with the above mentioned material remains implies a significantly strong technological base. Thus, it has been emphatically argued in the writings of D.D. Koshambi and R.S. Sharma that this was provided by the widespread use of iron. It was pointed out in unit number 18 that the Magadhan kingdom was located near the rich iron ore areas of southern Bihar and has and had access to important rivers and land routes. During excavations, different types of iron tools like socketed axes, sickles, and possibly plowshares have been found. These tools must have made the task of clearing the thick forest of the eastern Ganges plains easy and also facilitated the efficiency of agriculture. Numerous small heaps of iron slags have been found scattered all over the iron belt of South Bihar. Such refuse material left behind indicates that iron smelting may not have been of a very high quality. Local furnaces have been discovered may suggest that ordinary people probably had access to the use and manufacture of iron. Sophisticated techniques of making different kinds of iron were also known, as can be gleaned from the Arthashastra. The use of iron did not, however, diffuse from the Ganges Valley to the other parts of the country. Independent evidence of its use and availability has been found in excavated material dated to both pre-Mauryan and Mauryan times in other parts of India as well. However, it is clear that in the Ganges Valley at least, the soil being heavy and loamy, the necessity of heavy iron-tipped plugs and plowshares was most essential to make intensive agriculture possible. The use of iron for agricultural purposes cannot be overemphasized. That this was recognized by the state is evident from the Arthashastra, which advocates that the king should maintain a monopoly over certain kinds of mining. This was perhaps also suggested because of the crucial need of metals for military progress. Apart from sound technology, most expanding agrarian societies require a regular and cheap supply of labor for production of food, grains, and other commodities. How this labor is controlled and maintained is of crucial importance to understand the social basis of production. We have already indicated above that a new kind of cultivation had become important in the middle Ganges Valley, namely paddy cultivation. This was labor intensive and required more than the peasant families' labor at particular seasons of transplanting and harvesting. This kind of cultivation had become popular during this period. We also find that great stress was laid on bringing new land under cultivation. In these newly settled tracts, shortage of labor was expected. And from the Arthashastra, we learn how the state could make special attempts to settle the new areas. In this context, it is suggested that the Sudras were to settle these areas. They, in any case, formed the bulk of agricultural and other types of manual labor. Settling new groups could be done by transferring them from overpopulated areas or deporting them from the defeated kingdoms. The latter was probably the case with the 1.5 lakh people who were deported after the Kalinga War. The Arthashastra suggests that new villages could be formed also by inducing foreigners to immigrate to them. Other groups like carpenters and merchants were also probably settled in a similar fashion. The Sudra settlers were expected to be given some fiscal concession and also a supply of cattle and seeds along with implements. This was probably an encouragement to enable them to cultivate virgin soil. Decaying or ruined settlements were similarly to be repopulated because with a rehabilitated settlement only could agriculture production be augmented. In many cases, the newly settled areas formed part of the crown lands known as the Sita lands. On occasions, they were granted to ex-village officials or for cultivation. In these cases, the failure on the part of the farmers to cultivate would lead to their transfer to someone else. Since these villages were a part of the crown lands, obviously the king and his officials exercised strict control over them. Thus, during the Mauryan period, the two major prerequisites, namely the use and control of raw materials and manpower, made it possible for agrarian expansion to take place. We next turn to take a more detailed look at the material and economic expansion, in particular in the Ganges Valley, and on a general level in other parts of the India under the Mauryas. Agriculture and land revenue. In this section, we will discuss the general features of agrarian economy and land revenue organization. General features of agrarian economy. In the earlier section, we have seen that settlement of permanent villages was recognized in the Arthashastra as a method for the expansion of agrarian economy. These settlements ensured a sound and stable resource base for the state to extract taxes, and the land tax formed the bulk of it. This process of settlement was called Janpad Nivesh, but the extent of how this was done is not clearly known. According to R.S. Sharma, it would be reasonable to presume that most of the Ganges basin was brought under cultivation in this manner, and some efforts may have been made in the outlying areas as well. Growth of agriculture meant that the cultivator began to assume an increasingly important role. Megasthenes, in his account of the Indian society and its division into 7 classes, mentions the farmers as the second class, next only to the philosophers, who are mentioned as the first class, and followed by the soldiers, who are mentioned as the third class. Though his perception of the division of the Indian society was not absolutely correct, the farmers drew his attention because they were numerically a large class devoted to land. The classical sources specifically mention that the cultivators were without arms. Megasthenes also maintains that the peasants were left untouched during war. This seems difficult to believe as the example of the Kalinga war, and the figures quoted in the Ashokan inscriptions of those dead and deported must have included a fair number of peasants. We have already seen that some lands were Sita or crown lands. In these areas, the king's and the state's rights of possessions, cultivation, mortgage, and sale were naturally superior. In fact, in the Arthashastra, a Sita Dhyaksha or superintendent of agriculture is mentioned, who probably supervised the cultivation works here. These areas were in all probability fertile and suited to high productivity. It is difficult to identify the origin of these state farms. It is possible that their origin lay in large estates owned by individual landowners in pre-modern times. These were also areas where slaves were deployed working under direct state supervision. The advanced knowledge of agriculture techniques described in depth in the Arthashastra also probably refer to these lands. Agriculture in other areas of the Mauryan state known as Janpad territories was in all probability carried on privately. In the Jataka stories, there are frequent references to Ghapatis and Gram Bojkas. These groups are said to have employed hired laborers on land, indicating their capacity to do so as a land-owning gentry. In contrast, the laborers are described to be in pitiable condition, and sometimes slaves are also mentioned. The king could own land in his personal capacity in both Sita and Janpada areas, through direct references to this for this period are lacking. Thus, though it is not possible to discuss the full complexities of the land ownership pattern for the whole of India in detail, for the Ganges Valley alone, one can suggest that different types of it existed. This naturally entailed varied systems of cultivators and also different levels of agricultural development. The Arthashastra references to different types of agriculture operations supervised by officials thus refer to lands owned by either the state or king. However, a small section of the text deals with the sale of the land and building. This suggests that individuals could own small areas of cultivable land which they could cultivate themselves. The most important reason for the success of agriculture in the state-owned lands was the facility of irrigation provided by the state. There were rulers for the regulation of water supply for the benefit of agriculturists. Megasthenes inform us that a number of officers were employed who measured the land and inspected sluices by which water was distributed into the branch channels. That irrigation facilities existed in other areas as well is indicated by the mention of an irrigation cess amounting to a fifth, a fourth, or a third of the produce in the Arthashastra. Since this cess was levied only on irrigated soil, it can be deduced that the state regulated irrigation facilities in areas where rainfall was scarce. In these areas, a regular supply of water could ensure a normal yield of crops. Pushyagupta, one of the governors of Chandragupta Maurya, is said to have built a dam for creating a reservoir of water near Girnar in Saurashtra. This was known as Sudarshan Tadaga, that is water tank. This reservoir became so famous that its history can be traced to the middle of the 5th century AD for a period of about 8,000 years. Land revenue organization. The classical writers state that some villages were exempted from taxation. They were probably rare exceptions, and in fact, it has been suggested that this was so because these villages may have provided soldiers to the state. It is also suggested by scholars that in order to bring virgin soil under cultivation in some villages, remissions of taxes was allowed for a period of time. The essential resources needed for the Mauryan state could only be got from land revenue. Therefore, the land revenue collection had to be effectively organized so as to expropriate the maximum possible surplus from the people. It is generally stated that the Mauryan rule constitutes a landmark in the history of the improvement of the system of taxation in ancient India. The Mauryans, in fact, attached great importance to the assessment of land revenue, and the highest officer in charge of this was the Samaharta. The Sannidhata was the chief custodian of the state treasury. Since the revenue was also collected in kind, providing storage facilities was also the duty of the latter, that is the Sannidhata. The classical writers mention that 1/4 of the produce was paid in tax by the peasants. They also suggest that a tribute was paid by them. Land tax, that is bhag, was the main item of revenue. According to the texts, it was levied at the rate of 1/6 of the produce. But it is possible that in the Mauryan period it was quite high and levied at the rate of 1/4 of the produce. The Lumbini edict of Ashok says that when he visited Lumbini, the birthplace of Buddha, he exempted the village from the payment of Bali and reduced the payment of Bhag to 1/8. Even Ashok's great respect for the Buddha did not prompt the emperor to exempt the village totally from the payment of taxes. Sharecropping was another way by which the state collected agricultural resources. The sharecroppers were in the first place provided with seeds, oxen, etc., and received arable land for cultivation. In this kind of situation, the peasants probably gave half of the produce to the state. The above taxes were further supplemented by a large number of customary dues that the peasants had to pay. The Mauryas also introduced some new taxes and made already existing ones more effective. The peasants paid a tax called Pindakara, paid by husbandmen, which was assessed on grounds of villages. This was also customary in nature. Often, the villages had to supply provisions to the royal army passing through their respective territories, and this naturally increased their burden. The exact nature of Hiranya is also not known, but it was probably a tax paid in cash because Hiranya literally means gold. Bali, the traditionally known levy from the Vedic times, continued under the Mauryas, and all the above taxes, which are described by the Kautilya in the Arthashastra, must have burdened the peasantry considerably. Nonetheless, he continues to recommend that in case the state still falls short of its need, several other fiscal measures for periods of emergency could be made use of. For example, one such measure was the levy of Pranya, which literally meant a gift of affection. This is a tax first mentioned by Panini but elaborated upon for the first time in the Arthashastra. The Pranya amounted to 1/3 or 1/4 of the produce according to the nature of the soil. It is usually interpreted as a voluntary gift, but once put into practice, in reality it must have become obligatory. Further, in times of emergency, the cultivators could be forced to raise 2 crops. The importance of these measures was constantly emphasized as the country did face famines, and during these bleak periods, the level of revenue collection must have naturally fallen. As land revenue was the backbone of the Mauryan economy, the Arthashastra is careful in designing the revenue system of the state. It is particular in defining the different types of villages to be taxed, as the fertility of soil varied from place to place. There is also attention paid to special categories of revenue collectors and assessors. Undoubtedly then, the Mauryan state, at least in its major areas, must have ensured a substantial land revenue collection, without which the government machinery and the army would have been difficult to maintain. Trade and towns. The non-agrarian economy of the Magadhan Empire revolved around 2 interrelated developments. First is expansion of trade and commerce, and second is establishment of new towns and markets. The development of the agrarian economy had given a solid economic basis to the Mauryan Empire, particularly in the Ganges Valley. However, it was the expansion of the commercial economy that enabled it to extend its resource base to other parts of the country. Organization of trade. Trade did not suddenly develop during this period. It was part of the larger process of economic change which had begun much before the modern times. These Dhaka stories have frequent references to caravan traders carrying large quantities of goods to different parts of the country. The security provided by Mauryan rule enabled internal trade to blossom. Major trade routes to West Asia and Central Asia passed through northwest India. The main trade routes in northern India were along the river Ganges and Himalayan foothills. Major centers like Rajgriha in Magध and Kausambi near present-day Allahabad were connected in this way. Patliputra, the capital of Mauryas, had a particularly strategic location and was connected by the river and road in all four directions. The another route going to such sites as Sravasti and Kapilvastu was connected through the city of Vaishali. From Kapilvastu, this route linked up Kalsi, Hazara and eventually led up to the Peshawar. Magazines also talks of a land route connecting the northwest with Patliputra. In the south, it was connected to central India and in the southeast to Kalinga. This eastern route turned southwards to finally reach Andhra and Karnataka. The other part of the eastern route continued down to the Ganges Delta to Tamarlipti, which acted as an exit point for the south and southeast. From Kausambi, moving westwards, another route led to Ujjain. This continued either further west to the coast of Gujarat or west south across the Narmada and was regarded as the Dakshin Path, that is southern route. The overland route to countries of the west went via Takshila near Islamabad. The opening up of communications in various parts of the Indian subcontinent was the direct result of the expansion of settlements, as it facilitated movement from one place to another. This naturally fostered trade. Internal trade was considerably benefited because river transport had been improved once the forest around the valleys had been cleared under state initiative. The state's policy, particularly under Bindusar and Ashok, to have peaceful and friendly relations with the Greeks, gave fillip to foreign trade as well. Trade was carried on in different ways. It was intrinsically linked to the methods of production and its organization. Primarily in North India, craft production was organized on guild, that is Shreni lines. Guild matlab Shreni. This was so in the pre-Mauryan period as well. Under the Mauryas, when the number of the artisan groups had increased, we find guilds organized in different towns inhabiting particular sections of them. These guilds generally worked and lived together in a closely knit relationship. Craft was necessarily hereditary and, in most cases, specialization was handed down from father to son. These guilds became very powerful in the post-Mauryan period, as is evident from a number of inscriptions. Megasthenes also mentioned the artisans as one of the 7 castes or classes he noticed during his stay in India. The well-known guilds of the period were those of metallurgists of various kinds, carpenters, potters, leather workers, painters, textile workers, etc. Making of the northern black polished ware is a good example of craft activities. It became a specialized kind of pottery making craft, and its availability outside the Ganges Valley is limited. This indicates that it was a technique developed in this part of the country and was perhaps dependent on a particular type of clay available there. Like the artisans, the merchants were also organized along the guild lines. Certain kinds of merchants were connected to particular artisan groups, which made distribution of goods easier. They too inhabited identifiable parts of the cities, which came to be associated with their professions. It is, however, important to note that the state administration under the Mauryas also took up the organization of trade. This administrative control on production and distribution made it more efficient. This did not mean that it directly interfered with and changed the guild organization. On the other hand, it increased its control on the distribution of their goods and itself became a producer. At another level, it gradually converted some crafts into some sort of small-scale industries. The state did this by directly employing some of the artisans like armorers, shipbuilders, builders in stone, etc. They were exempt from payments of tax because they rendered compulsory labor service to the state. Other artisans like spinners, weavers, miners, etc., who worked for the state were liable to tax. The above mentioned steps to organize trade and commodity production were part and parcel of the state policy. This policy was aimed at augmenting its efficiency in economic spheres of activity and its revenues. Magazines mentions the superintendent of commerce, whose duty was to fix prices of goods and also to interfere if there was a glut in any commodity. He is also mentioned in the Arthashastra as Panyadaksha. This text lists the various officials that were in charge of the different economic activities. The office of the Samsthadaksha that looked after the markets was intact to check. The office of the Samsthadaksha. The office of the Samsthadaksha that looked after the markets was in fact to check the wrong practices of the traders. The Pautavadakshas or superintendent of weights, the Pautavadakshas or superintendent of weights and measures exerted strict control on maintaining standard weights and measures. State boards that facilitated transport were put under the charge of Nav Adakshas. He helped in regulating river transport and collecting ferry charges. All traders had to pay taxes and custom duties ranging from 1/5 to 1/25 of the values of the goods. These were supposed to be collected by a superintendent of tolls called the Shulk Adhaksh. Where the state produced goods, different categories of officials looked after particular departments. These goods were called Rajapanya. The state was careful to choose those areas of commodity production and trade that were essential for its functioning and yielded good revenues. Sometimes, state goods could also be sold by private traders as their network of distribution was more well organized and widespread. Despite the above changes, it would be right to conclude that the majority of artisans either continue to work individually or within the complex structure of the guilds. The guilds continue to serve the very important purpose of cohesively organizing petty producers and, most importantly, controlling them. Even the artisans found it advantageous to join them, since this eliminated the expenses of working alone or competing with others of the same profession. From the state's point of view, the guilds facilitated the collection of taxes. Finally, since they concentrated locally and also specialized in particular crafts, there was a strengthening of that particular trade. We need, however, to conclude with the point that the guilds were not found to flourish in all parts of India during this period, particularly in the extreme south. Even in the post-Mauryan period, it is difficult to find mention of them. The major prerequisite of guilds to flourish was of course an urban milieu, to which we now turn our attention. Growth of urban economy. The process of urbanism, which had begun in the pre-Mauryan period, witnessed further growth in the Mauryan period. Two major sections of population inhabited the towns, namely artisans and merchants and the officials of the government. The urban economy, characterized by the activities of the manufacturers of goods and of merchants, and also by a system of exchange, began to spread from the Ganges Valley to other areas of western and central India, the Deccan and South India. Proliferation of rural settlements and the prosperity of the Ghapatis enabled the social base of urban centers to expand further. In many cases, it were the rich rural families that developed contacts with towns and provided financial support needed particularly by merchant groups. We introduced this unit with the discussion on the material remains of the Mauryan phase to show that the urban centers had definitely increased during this period. It is, however, impossible to measure this growth. Growing by Kautilya's Arthashastra, we learn that through a process of Durganivesh or Durgavidhan, the state founded walled towns. These towns were said to be propelled by priests, nobles, soldiers, and also merchant, artisans, and others. There are also detailed descriptions in this text on the protection of towns and their layout, so that economic regulations could be carried out properly. Indeed, the Arthashastra viewed towns, that is Durga, as it viewed the Janapadas, as an important source of revenue. The taxes received from the towns paid rich dividends to the state, and therefore development and administration of towns was given much importance by the Mauryas. In fact, when mention is made of taxing guilds located in the capital of Durga, we get an impression that those in the countryside enjoyed exemption. This may have been because town population was easier to regulate and organize. Megasthene's detailed description of the Mauryan capital gives us some idea about how towns were administered and which areas of urban economy were regulated in the interest of the state. He tells us that Patliputra was administered by 30 officials who were divided into 6 committees of 5 members each. Of these 6 committees, 4 were related to economic activity. These were committees dealing with industrial arts, trade and commerce, the supervision of the public sale of manufactured goods, and the collection of tax on articles sold. The other 2 committees were concerned with the welfare of foreigners and the restoration of births and deaths. The general administration of law and order in the cities was thus important to ensure the proper functioning of its economic activities. The above description may apply to other similar big and developed cities in the heartland of the Mauryan Empire. In the absence of enough information, it is not possible to describe the exact nature of the administration of small cities, port towns, and pilgrimage centers. What is, however, important to emphasize is that the development to the Mauryan economy in general made it possible for towns of various kinds to flourish. Population mobility and interaction between social groups was necessary for the urban economy to remain healthy and prosperous. This could be ensured by a certain degree of political stability in the metropolitan and core areas of the empire. Another significant aspect of the urban economy is that it created the situation for the development of transactions in cash and the circulation of coined money. Though the use of currency began in an earlier period, it became fairly common during the Mauryan period because of the development of commerce. Its use in trade is self-evident, but the importance of cash in the economy can be gauged from the fact that it was probably used to pay salaries of the officials. The Arthashastra lists for us the range of salaries expected to be paid, and this varied from 48,000 panas to 60 panas annually. For such a powerful cash economy to function, the minting of coins and the supply of metals like silver and copper required to do so were of prime importance. That these were harnessed by the Mauryas is evident from the innumerable punched marked, mostly silver, coins which are assignable to this period. Of these, the majority are stated to be from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which constituted the core area of the empire. For the kind of the urban economy that envisaged substantial state control, the state also had to maintain a monopoly in certain important spheres of activity. Thus, the Arthashastra provides for a superintendent of mines called Akhara Superintendent of mines kya? Akara whose chief function was to look for new mines and reopen old ones. Like mining metals, another area of state monopoly was mining salt. The importance of different kinds of metals, not only for minting coins, but for such important commodities as making weapons, cannot be underestimated. Thus, we find the mention of a superintendent of iron called Lohadaksha in the Arthashastra. Apart from equipping soldiers with arms, the government was probably also concerned about supplying implements for agriculture. The concern for keeping a monopoly over mining and trading in mineral products thus secured for the Mauryan state the most crucial raw materials. Proper utilization of these in turn secured for them a greater return in both agrarian and non-agrarian sectors. Once economic control of urban centers was established and their administration well regulated, control over various janpadas through these towns also increased. Due to an increase in commercial transactions, the centers of exchange and trade had also increased in number. In the next subsection, we shall discuss the different avenues through which socio-economic changes reached out to different parts of Mauryan India. Again, as in other spheres of economy, the Mauryan control of such centers varied from one region to another. Socio-economic changes in the Mauryan India. From the above discussion, it appears that the most distinguishing feature of the Mauryan economy was the emphasis on state control in agriculture, trade and industry. We have shown that it was necessary for the state to levy a variety of taxes. The requirements of resources for the Mauryan state were very high. The taxes realized from the region of the Magध and adjoining areas were not enough to meet this demand. Therefore, attempts were made to control resources in other parts of country as well. For example, Kalinga, the Karnataka Plateau and Western India, where Ashokan inscriptions are found, were such areas. To regulate certain types of economic activities in such far off regions, the Mauryas worked out different strategies. This depended on the nature of resources of particular region offered. The conquest of Kalinga, for instance, offered control of an agriculturally rich area as well as the control of important trade routes that passed through it to the mineral rich areas of South India. Thus, the main motive behind acquiring such regions as Karnataka seems to have been that they were rich in gold and other precious materials. What about those areas where Mauryan inscriptions are not found? It has been recently argued by Romila Thapad that it is difficult to gauge the political or economic control of the Mauryans in such region. Northern Deccan, the Punjab and Sindh and Rajasthan may be cited as examples of such areas. What is the extent of their influence on the economies of the areas where their presence is indicated? Here it may be suggested that no large-scale restructuring was done even in these areas. The main interest of the Mauryas was the exploitation of resources of these areas, and they depended on influential sections of population in these areas for doing this. It may be pointed out that most regions outside the Ganges Valley were at different levels of economic development in this period. Because of this uneven development, radical change and restructuring of all these sections was very difficult. The Arthashastra and the inscriptions of Ashoka tells us about the tribes, that is Atavikas and Aranyakaras that inhabited the various parts of the empire. They often separated the more developed areas from the less developed areas. Kautilya's advice to the state was to win them over to a settled agrarian life. He devoted a full chapter to how tribes could be systematically broken up, and several methods, fair or unfair, were deployed to do this. This was necessary in order that groups of 5 to 10 families could settle down permanently for bringing more land under cultivation. Ashok's attitude towards the tribes was paternalistic, but he too warns them that in case they failed to confirm or disobey orders of the Mahamatras, stern action would be taken against them. Controlling of the forest tribes was important from 2 points of view. First, it was necessary for new agrarian settlements to be secure, as disturbances from tribes would interrupt their economic development. Secondly, trade routes often bordered or passed through tribal regions, and these had to be made secure. It is difficult to have an exact idea of how many tribal groups were thus converted to peasants, but that the process was encouraged by the state is significant to take note of. Archaeological evidence for many parts of India shows habitation sites that were not fully developed as urban centers during this period. The case of the innumerable megalith sites, especially those dated back to the 3rd century BC or so, in many parts of the Deccan and South India, indicate simple farming or pastoral communities with only limited knowledge of craft production. It was impossible to totally change the cultural pattern of a vast country like India in the 3rd century BC, but at the same time, Mauryan rule did initiate some major changes in the material and socio-economic setting, which bore fruits in the subsequent centuries. Some of these changes may be briefly highlighted. In many areas of Mauryan Empire, such as North and West Bengal, Kalinga, the Deccan, and also in the neighboring South, the beginning of the early historical cultural pattern dating to only Mauryan or post-Mauryan periods. This means that impressive human settlements like towns and cities in which different social groups lived, use of coins, use of scripts, use of sophisticated objects on a significant scale, all began in these regions only from the Mauryan and post-Mauryan periods. This change in material culture implies that there were not only changes in technological and material life in general, but also in social organization and in ideas. Society started becoming organized in a much more complex manner, resulting in separation between social groups and ultimately in the institution of the state. The fact that we find local states appearing in many of the regions after the Mauryans suggests that the process of major socio-economic change associated with the production of surplus in society began in many parts of India through contact with the important regions of the Magadhan Empire. Now let us sum up. In this unit, we have discussed various aspects related to economic changes in India during the Mauryan period. With the help of recent writings on the subject, we have introduced you to the view that the Mauryas did not exert direct economic control in equal measures in all regions of India. Their interest in establishing economic contacts with different parts of the empire essentially varied. In the major regions of the empire, the degree of control was certainly greater and more direct. In this unit, you have studied the material and social basis of production which was fundamental for economic growth, the main elements of agrarian expansion and the pattern of land ownership, how the state appropriated the agrarian surplus through the levy of various land taxes, the dynamics of trade and its organization and the extent to which the state interfered in this sphere of economic activity, and the various aspects of the urban economy and the technology. So keywords, सेस का मतलब होता है टैक्स. क्लासिकल सोर्सेज रेफर्स टू द ग्रीक सोर्सेज ऑफ फॉर एग्जांपल द इंडिका ऑफ मैगस्थीन्स. डिफ्यूजन का मतलब होता है सेपरेट फ्रॉम ए सेंटर ऑफ ए रीजन. फिजिकल का मतलब होता है इकोनॉमिक एंड फाइनेंशियल मेजर्स. गृहपति होता है हेड ऑफ रिच लैंड ओनिंग फैमिली. मेगालिथ होता है मेगालिथ्स एज अ जनरल टर्म रेफर टू बरियल्स इन विच बिग और मेगा ब्लॉक्स ऑफ द स्टोन्स दैट इज लिथ्स आर यूज्ड. द मेगालिथ्स could be of different phases of culture, and even now megaliths are built in some areas of India. In the context of the present block, the megaliths more specifically relate to the cultures of the regions like Vidarbha, the Deccan and the south, where megalithic culture phase preceded the emergence of early historical culture characterized by the use of permanent structures, cities and towns, use of scripts and coins and of kingdoms. Samharth, assessor of the land revenue. Sannidhata होता है treasurer. सेडेंट्री होते हैं सेटल्ड परमानेंटली. सीता लैंड होती है लैंड्स ओन्ड या कंट्रोल डायरेक्टली बाय द किंग. वर्ण होता है जनरली ट्रांसलेटेड एज कास्ट और क्लास, इंडिकेटिंग द ट्रेडिशनल डिवीजन ऑफ ब्राह्मणिकल सोसाइटी इनटू 4 ग्रुप्स.